Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Bucket Think Tank. And what I wanted to talk about today was, well, Thor. In the Marvel Universe right now, Thor's in sort of a weird spot. No, not as weird as it was a few months to a year ago, honestly. I don't know if you guys have heard, but recently, or not so much recently, but our boy Thor had been unworthy of the hammer, and in his place, as he called himself Odinson, was a new Thor, a female Thor, who has been going around doing the best she can, and it's been an interesting ride. And recently she died, and then she didn't die. Or rather, she was brought back. She got Dragon Ball Z back into reality. But not even in an interesting way, so much as it's just Thor and, well, Odinson at the time and his father going, channel the God Storm and whatnot. And this whole time, knowing that, we have this sort of coming in like the death of the mighty Thor coming on the 16th, I figured, well, let's sort of talk about, sort of how we got to this point. And I wanted to cover a couple of points. The hammer, um, the idea of female Thor, how our main Thor felt about this and how he dealt with it, and coming up to the the identity of the female Thor. So when it came to the hammer for this new run on Marvel, we sort of had to accept that there wasn't going to be a lot of changes until we were told there were going to be changes. The hammer's been pretty consistent. Mjolnir's been pretty consistent in terms of exactly how it's supposed to work. But with the arrival of female Thor, there was a change when a woman grabbed it and it said, instead of saying like whoever holds his hammer, if he be worthy, now it changes if she be worthy, which was honestly not that big a deal of a change, but it didn't feel like it was necessary. And the idea that you could easily just put they, if they be worthy, will gain the powers of Thor. That would have made more sense, but we had to go for the she to let you know. But I think we've already figured out it was a woman once we found out this Thor has long blonde hair, a bosom, and presumably a female voice. So yeah, and then we found out later on exactly what the hammer's real powers are, where they come from. And they come from a mother storm, this huge epic space storm that Odin fought eons ago. Like he physically fought the storm, and with his last bit of strength, he was able to defeat it. And then he had it put into Mjolnir, and that's where the hammer's powers come from. That's why it's so strong, and why it's sometimes inconsistent over the years. But whatever. What matters is we know some new stuff about the hammer, and it may or may not be sentient. As our female Thor attests, the hammer did call to her, so it more than likely is sentient. So then we come up to female Thor. So when female Thor was announced, or rather when she was revealed in the pages of Jason Aaron's Thor God of Thunder, Jason Aaron, who's been writing Thor ever since Thor God of Thunder, their fan base was a bit divided. The question was, why was this happening, and why doesn't this make much sense? And it really didn't, in the idea that when this new Thor came in, we didn't know why she was called Thor. She has the powers of Thor, doesn't quite make her Thor in the same sense, I guess. The question was, what was Jason Aaron trying to do here? It felt like he was turning the idea of Thor into a mantle that at some point will be passed on to someone else, sort of like the Flash or the Green Lantern. So the question was, did that work? And for a lot of people, it didn't, for the very important reason Thor's name isn't just a title, so to speak. Thor Odinson is his full name. His name is Thor. This new figure wielding the hammer doesn't get to be called Thor, but we the in and outside universe have associated the person with the hammer as Thor for one reason or another. And it just sort of felt like a reach. And then this was in the beginnings, or at least the relative, almost the middle of the SJW Marvel push that was going on. The idea that Marvel was going for more political correctness, going for more diversity over quality. in terms of their books. And I honestly want to say that at best, female Thor just got caught in the crosshairs. I don't think there was any real intent from Jason Aaron, at least, as far as I can tell, looking at this book to an extent to, push some agenda here. I think Jason Aaron just wanted to tell a story, and then that story got caught up in the ether that was, SJW Marvel. Well, I could be wrong about that. It didn't help that one of the first little moments with this new Thor was her dealing with Crusher Creel and Titania. So, Crusher Creel brought in the idea that, okay, well, what did you do to Thor? Why, you Thor? You're a feminist coming in here. And what are you doing? You send our boy Thor to, like, sensitivity camp to be more PC. Look, no one cares if you're a girl that wants to be a superhero. That's fine, but make your own hero. And that was pretty much, Jason Aaron, reflecting the fan base that who were very much against this idea, who felt that it was pandering for the sake of pandering, that you didn't feel this female character could stand on her own. And as I guess his response to it, Jason Aaron just had Thor hit him with the hammer. And then Titania sort of came in pushing her own idea that, yeah, you're a female hero. Yeah, good. You're Thor now. I'm not even going to fight you. And this female Thor knocks her out cold. And then all the female superheroes and Marvel come in to help her. It's sort of weird that happened, I think. I think had it just been, people like Sif and Valkyrie, Agent Som, had this kept, within the family, so to speak, the book, that would have been more interesting. Or at least more subtle than, every female superhero coming in to, like, show the support. I'm like, so every female superhero doesn't question this? That why she can wield the hammer when, our previous Thor couldn't? That was a bit too much, I think, at least for me. And then we had to deal with the question of exactly who this, character was. And of course, at the middle of this mystery was our previous Thor, or as he calls himself at this point, Odinson, because he's not, he's not wielding the hammer, and that quote unquote doesn't make him Thor, which is his name, so that doesn't make sense. So from Odinson's perspective, he's clearly had better days. But let's just sort of wind the clock back a bit to the events of Original Sin. So Original Sin was the question of who killed the Watcher and who took his eyes. So we found out that Nick Fury took the eyes. It was also written by Jason Aaron. So we're seeing the control he's had over this. And Nick Fury, with the eyes of the Watcher, whispers into Thor's ears, and he goes, "What did thou say?" And he crash lands on the ground because he can't lift his hammer. Remember, the hammer is ridiculously heavy. Like, it's been mentioned that if it was any bigger, even if he was worthy or not, Odinson wouldn't be able to lift it. So then Odinson loses his arm in a fight with Malekith the Accursed, and then he sees this upstart wielding his hammer, doing stuff with it even he didn't know that could be done with it. So he then proceeds to go find out who is this new Thor. At first he thinks it's Lady Sif, it's Agent Solomon, it's Jane Foster, and all these are thrown out the window one way or another. Whether Lady Sif just bites his head off saying, "Of course it's not me, I don't care about your hammer." Jane Foster with her cancer, so she's more than likely unable to do anything. And then Agent Solomon, who, as he sees, descends down from her flying car right next to the new Thor, is like, okay, so it's not Agent Solomon. And for the most part, Odinson's just kind of done. He doesn't really feel like he belongs anywhere, because he's tied himself to the hammer, to that identity. To him, he's not Thor. Why he calls him Odinson, and he just sort of packs up and leaves. We don't quite know what he's doing until the events of Unworthy Thor, in which case it turns out he's not that far away. He's usually just hanging around, killing space trolls, and just trying to lose himself in his misery. Until he finds out that there's an ultimate hammer. This was a hammer wielded by the Ultimate Universe Thor, And he's just like, I'm going to go down there. I'm going to get it. I'm going to, prove myself worthy, that I'm still Thor to some degree, because he hasn't felt like Thor. He hasn't been able to summon lightning. He hasn't felt like himself. And then, over the course of this adventure to get the Ultimate Hammer, we meet Beta Ray Bill, who also at one point was worthy of the hammer. And he goes to sort of like these places in his memories. He's having nightmares about the hammer. He remembers talking to Jane Foster about, that he fears one day he will not be worthy to lift the hammer. Like every day he just sort of stares at it for a while, wondering whether or not he'll be able to lift it. So there's a great sense of fear every time he picks up the hammer from the table in the morning. And then he remembers how, broken he felt when someone else had a hammer, when he couldn't lift it. And he's sort of going through all these thoughts as he grabs the Ultimate Hammer, and he gets this surge of powers like, I know who I am, and this is not my hammer. And he resolves, like, you know what, this is mine. This belongs to some other Thor, and it's not my hammer. I'm going to get my hammer back. I'm going to prove myself worthy. And we don't quite know what he plans to do at that point, so it's sort of a moot point, and we won't find out what he's doing at all, really, in terms of what he will do to become worthy. And all we really know ultimately is that the person who will take this Ultimate Hammer will be Volstagg to become the War Thor, which was a really fun little adventure, but not what we're talking about right now. We also find out exactly what it was that Nick Fury whispered into Thor's ear that made him unable to lift the hammer, and it was simply, Gorr was right. So in Jason Aaron's run, his earlier run of Thor: God of Thunder, Thor, three versions of Thor, Young Thor, Avengers Thor, and Allfather Thor, had to battle with the being known as Gorr the God Butcher. And Gorr was effectively going around killing gods because, in his mind, none of them were worthy. They were all terrible. They were not deserving of man, of anyone. And that resonated a lot with our Thor, with our Avengers Thor. And it was still hanging in the back of his mind. And when Nick Fury said that to him, it shattered his confidence. Because this was effectively coming from someone who had the eyes of the Watcher. And it shook him to his core because he always sort of believed that no god was worthy. And to hear it again from someone else, someone of that level or with that amount of power and omnipotence, shakes him to his core. Remember, his confidence is dashed. The reason he's not worthy is effectively because he doesn't believe he is worthy. So the question is, what can Thor do to make himself feel worthy? And we don't know. And I think that's one of the questions that need to be answered going into this new run of Thor stories by Jason Aaron. After that came this other person, the identity of female Thor. So we find out, actually relatively early on, if you think about it, who the female Thor is. It's Jane Foster. So Jane Foster has cancer, which is why no one thought she was Thor, and she also serves as a member of the Council of Realms, which is, the political body designed to help, orchestrate the day-to-day affairs of Asgard and the other realms. So it turns out that when Odinson was, still unable to wield the hammer, and things were getting worse, like the War of the Nine Realms, led by Malekith the Accursed, was going on, Jane has been called by the hammer, and she walks down there. She walks right past Heimdall, who also presumes he knows what's going on, grabs the hammer, becomes Thor, and that's sort of how that story goes. And for a while, we didn't quite get it, but then we find out that this is killing her. So Jane Foster, like most people with cancer, go for chemotherapy. The thing is, though, when Jane grabs the hammer, or activates the hammer to become Thor, the hammer removes the chemo from her body because it views it as a poison. So effectively, all of her chemo treatments, her chemotherapy, her cancer gets regressed, it's unimpeded. It's unimpeded for the most part. Her entire recovery has been set back to 0 each time she puts it down. And she's very aware of that, and that's sort of what makes her more heroic, because she's aware of the risk, aware of the dangers. and the fact that by becoming Thor, she's effectively throwing her life away. And in her mind, she's like, the world needs a Thor. The world needs to believe in gods again. And it's honestly the main reason I was like, okay, you know what? I liked this character. I like the direction this is going in, at least at its essence. This temporary change is going to have a profound effect on our boy Odinson, which will hopefully proceed to make him worthy. That was my thoughts when I heard about this, and I actually read it too. And the problem was this sort of just kept going on a bit too long. Jane Foster Thor was in the Avengers. She was in Civil War II. She was fighting Loki. She was fighting Odin. She was trying to stop, the War of the Nine Realms. There was this huge epic story going on, but at the same time, it also felt like the story wasn't really going anywhere. Because the main big story, other than, whether or not this Thor Odinson will get his hammer back or whether or not Jane Foster will die before that, was the question of the War of the Nine Realms. And that never quite gets resolved. It's sort of like the story sort of mired in the politics of Asgardia. As Freya sort of attempts to, at one point, sort of to place Odin. Then we have Jane Foster fighting Odin, sort of bringing her own personal grievances with Odin, and the fact that he wouldn't let her and Thor get married. Her issues with Loki, these weren't over-the-top things, but they weren't like multiple issues dedicated to these. But it always felt like, we could resolve these stories now if we didn't spend time talking about this. Or seeing Jane Foster sort of go through all this. And seeing Jane go through it was an adventure onto itself. It was inspiring onto itself. And a lot of people who either were going through chemo or knew someone going through chemo sort of drew inspiration from this. But at the same time, it's like, okay, when is this going to end? Because we know it's temporary. We know it's temporary. Nothing in comics like this would ever be permanent. But because it wasn't, and the cancer effectively put a time clock on it, we kind of were like, okay, when's this going to run out? And then at some point, we do find out when it's going to run out. So after, battles with the Phoenix Force and War Thor and I hope I said this right, the Shi'ar Empire, Jane comes to the realization that if she puts the hammer down, she won't be able to, pick back up again. It might kill her to put it down. And at one point, while talking to when she collapses after the fight with the War Thor, she is, met by Doctor Strange, who already knew that she was Jane Foster because he's the Sorcerer Supreme. He can see through magic. He tells her, look, in my professional opinion as a doctor and a Sorcerer Supreme, if you pick that hammer up, it will kill you. Because her body undergoes a lot of stress when she transforms and when she detransforms. Is anyone worthy of the gods? Is anyone worthy of your petty games or your attention? And that sort of is interesting because to see her now becoming this person, it's sort of interesting to see the direction going at there for Jane Foster, that she becomes the god that people need to believe in. But at the same time, I don't feel that what Jane Foster said there in the past equals up to this one here, because what that Jane Foster said to Thor was that gods have to be better of deserving the worship they get from people, the love and adoration. But here Jane Foster sort of, if anything, just inspiring other members of Asgardia, if anything. So I'm not quite sure how that works, at least from how I've been seeing it for the most part. I don't know. But when Jane realizes that, no progress is being made against the Man-God, that, Odin and Odinson aren't able to hold him back, she eventually takes the hammer, goes there, fights the Man-God. And even she can't beat him. So what she does is she ties the Man-God up in chains that we use to tie up Fenrir. And she ties that to the hammer, and she sends the hammer into the sun, pulling the Man-God with her. And that means she dies. And she's okay with that. And honestly, it was a really great moment to think that the greatest hero, the greatest god Asgardia had ever seen, was a dying woman. That, I think, should have did all that needed to be said, especially when we see Odinson, well, we'll just start calling him Thor now, not presents, just sort of carries her body to the moon, after everything's said and done. As all of Asgardia, for the most part, just sees that it's Jane Foster was Thor. But then it's undercut when Thor uses the God Storm, the Mother Storm, with Odin to bring her back and pull her from Valhalla, because also Jane Foster doesn't want to die just yet. So she's brought back, and now she's undergoing chemo because she can't be Thor anymore. And she tells our Thor, our modern day Thor, because there's no point in calling him Odinson anymore, that he needs to get focus on being worthy. He needs to be worthy because the world needs a Thor. And he presents her with this little bit of Mjolnir, just a little bit, and he can barely hold it. So it's still reminding us that he isn't worthy, but that she's saying, like, look, you need to be worthy. And that's how the comic ends, with Thor saying, like, what, I've got some ideas. I've got some ideas about what we can do with Asgardia, what we can do about the War of the Nine Realms. And Jane Foster sort of walks off and looks off into the sunset, and sort of reminding herself, like, yeah, like she liked being Thor. She liked being able to fly, which is always interesting. Like, the gods above us and whatnot. And that was sort of it. And honestly, looking back on everything, I get the trepidation and the hesitation with accepting the female Thor. It felt like a rather forced idea in some ways, but at the same time, there was some good stuff being told here. Jane Foster, I think, was at her best in this story. She was at her most inspiring. But yeah, the story did it really did feel like it was its own chapter of the much bigger story. Jason Aaron himself said, the War of the Nine Realms is just beginning. It was never going to be Jane Foster who ends the War of the Nine Realms. It's more than likely going to be our boy Thor with his golden hammer and golden arms just look gaudy. But, that's sort of it. And if you guys read any part of Mighty Thor, Thor God of Thunder, and you've got any thoughts about this, leave your thoughts down in the comment section. What do you think is going to happen with Thor's hammer? Like, is it a new one? Is Mjolnir just in the center of that golden one? I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, and I'll catch you all later. This is Debug Think Tank signing out. May your fandom serve you well.